There's a guy named Jordan Peterson who said, if you think tough men are bad, just see the damage a weak leader can do. We've had weak leaders all over the world right now. Remember, leadership and education go hand in hand. And there's a lot of people who are not here to learn or not learning because they're probably in college or something, learning nothing. This country and the world needs, as you know, Europe's in trouble. They don't think the EU is going to make it. China's in trouble. Japan's in serious trouble. The world's in trouble. And it's in trouble because of lack of leadership. And as President John Kennedy said, leadership and learning go hand in hand, basically. I mean, I'm not Republican or Democrat, but I just can't believe what's going on in our government. I mean, how can they open the borders? How can they cut off the the Keystone XL pipeline? We have food shortages. Sri Lanka, which is one of the richest island nations in the world, is in rioting right now. So we need leaders. You know what we do, we print money to solve our problems. And all that does is increase debt and creates more freeloaders, social welfare. I'm not against social welfare, but don't print money to pay for it. At the same time, our debt escalates. Our debt to GDP right now is 120%. At 90% debt to GDP, we're bankrupt. That means for every dollar we spend, we go deeper in debt right now. So our debt is now in the trillions. I don't know how many trillions it really, I've heard it's 260 trillion. I don't know how they measure it anymore. At the same time, they raise interest rates into a recession. This has never been done before. So that's why I'm saying there's somebody intentionally doing something to bring America down and the world down. The purpose of a leader is not to be the leader. The purpose of a leader is to take what a great leader like Patrick does and pass that lesson on. Stock markets, when they crash, go down in 3 phases. Boom, boom, boom. Phase 1 was a bounce. It was called a bear market rally. This baby is going down, I hope, because I'm going to get richer. See, the thing right now is if you're afraid, it's because you got bad advice in your head. One of the biggest problems we have today is this gap between rich and poor. It sets up revolution. And I don't think that's a mistake.
Americans have been living with inflation for over a decade. It's just that the inflation didn't show up in a dramatic way on consumer prices until more recently. Because all of the monetary policies that we have pursued since the 2008 financial crisis, it can all be summed up in one word: inflation. Inflation was deliberately created, not only by the Federal Reserve, but by the ECB, by the Bank of England, which, by the way, today actually reported 10.1% year-over-year inflation, and the Bank of Japan. Quantitative easing is simply another word for inflation. What is quantitative easing? Printing money and buying government bonds. That's inflation. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply. That is literally where the word inflation comes from. You get an old Webster dictionary, and you can even find these on the internet, and you see how inflation was defined, and it's defined as an expansion of the money supply. Prices going up are just a result of inflation. But the government really wanted to change the definition of inflation from an expansion of the money supply to an increase in prices so they can confuse the public as to the source of inflation. Because if the public realizes that inflation is expanding money supply, well, they know exactly who's controlling the money supply. But if they think inflation is rising prices, the government can blame it on the people who are raising prices, greedy businessmen or Putin, right? Or somebody like that. Right. They can point fingers at everybody, but accept responsibility for themselves. So the government has created the inflation. And by the way, the Inflation Reduction Act will result in even more inflation being created by the government. The difference is that for years and years and years, the inflation that entered the economy predominantly affected asset prices. So why did stock prices go way up Inflation. Why did real estate prices go way up? Inflation. Why did bond prices go way up? Inflation. Why did the price of, antique cars or, art, why did everything go up in price? Inflation. Why did cryptocurrencies go up in price? Inflation. The Fed inflated these massive asset bubbles with all the money that it created. But as I was warning, going back to day one, when they first did quantitative easing, when they did QE for the first time, they didn't call it QE1 until they had QE2. But when they did the first QE, I said that there would be a QE2. I said there would be a QE3. I said back then that we would have more QEs than Rocky movies. We've now had 4. QE5 is coming up. That's how many Rocky movies we had. But the reason I knew the government would keep repeating it is because I knew it wouldn't work. All they would do is blow air back into a bubble, and then every time the air started seeping out, they would want to blow more back in. Because QE doesn't solve the problem, it exacerbates the problem. But now the problem is that all that monetary inflation has now worked its way through financial assets, and it has ended up where I always knew it would, in goods prices, consumer goods, producer goods, and this is where it's going to stay. And if the Federal Reserve goes back to QE again, which I think it will, because we're already in a recession and they're going to try to stimulate the economy at some point, especially when we really start hemorrhaging jobs again, when they go back to QE, it's not going to look anything like the previous doses. We're going to have an explosion in consumer prices because inflation is already well above their so-called 2% target. And if the Fed throws gasoline on this fire, even with inflation 3 or 4 times its ceiling, the markets are going to react very differently. I think we're going to have a crisis in the dollar. I think the dollar is going to crash. And I think bond prices are going to soar. It's going to be a sovereign debt crisis. And so it's going to look a lot different than what we've experienced in the past decade or so.